All right, we are live. Hello, 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 everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Cosmic Connection. For those of you who don't know me, I am Joji, Astrology Hub's podcast producer, and I don't think I need to introduce Rick Levine. It's his show. He's here every month. And today we're doing the June horoscope, which Rick says the theme of the month is progress or review, question mark. And we'll unpack what that means in just a second. For those of you who are new to the channel, welcome. We talk about astrology all the time. We have pretty much an episode almost every day of the week. And if you're not subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and that bell button to be notified whenever we have another episode. And with that, I think we're done with introductions. I think we're ready to jump right in. How are you,
Let's
Rick?
jump. Let's jump. I
On the
haven't seen you.
floor,
I haven't seen you for a few days.
right?
Joe was here in Seattle at NORWAC, the Northwest Astrology Conference, and this was a great NORWAC for me because it was the first one in decades that I was not a speaker and I was not writing a daily horoscope column. So I was free to just make trouble and have fun and hang with friends, and it was good to see you there, Joe.
Yeah, I also was on the same boat. That was, well, I haven't been to as many conferences as you have, but that was my first conference where I wasn't working as well. And I was just a social, busy bee, just talking to everybody. I made
Yeah,
so many friends.
there
Nomak
were
is my favorite.
yeah, there were a lot. I mean, I don't know, probably about 450 people plus. I don't know,
Hmm.
and most of them, at least all the ones that I talked to, seemed to be amazing. So I love Norwalk, and it was great to see you. And now let's get down to work.
Yeah, it was great to see you too. All right,
So
so you said the theme of the month is progress or review, question mark. Why is that?
yeah, I suppose if I said it right, I wouldn't need to say there was a question mark. I could go progress or review.
Hmm.
That would have done it. Um, well, you see, the thing is that we're coming off. Not only we're coming off of a Mercury retrograde, but on yesterday on the what is it, the 31st of May, Mercury actually direct reached the degree where it had gone stationary, retrograde, which means that even though Mercury had been moving direct for the last couple of weeks of May, Mercury is now moving in territory that it hadn't reached before. Astrologers, and this is a relatively recent term, I think coined by my friend Roxana Muse, who just recently passed. And that concept or that term is the shadow of a planet is the area when it retrogrades, where it goes direct over an area, retrograde over the same area, and then direct over the same area until it clears or emerges from the shadow, which on June 1st, we have the first day of Mercury moving into new territory past 15 and a half degrees of Taurus. And the thing is that this gives us the sense of moving into new territory. And in a way, we are. And actually, we still have a number of other planets, all the inner planets now, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, and Jupiter, are all moving direct. However, Pluto turned retrograde last month, and this month in June, we have both Saturn and Neptune turning retrograde. And so we're getting this deeper rhythm of the outer planets one by one turning retrograde, and it gives us a feeling of being anchored to the past or covering old territory, but in a very slow motion kind of a way. In fact, Pluto, which it turned retrograde, but it now backs into Capricorn on June 11th. Pluto barely moves a half a degree, even less than that, for the entire month of June. And in fact, because Saturn is also turning retrograde on June 17th, Saturn has slowed down. So we open the month with Saturn at 7 degrees and 0 minutes of Pisces, and we close the month with Saturn at 7 degrees and I think 5 minutes of Pisces. The outer planets are not giving us a lot this month. Between Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, none of them move more than a degree, or Uranus moves, I think, closer to 2 degrees over the whole month. But the thing is that on a personal level, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, Venus moving, into new sign Leo, where it's going to stay forever because it turns retrograde in Leo. Mars having been in Gemini in its retrograde forever and now breezing through Cancer, and Mars being also in Leo. And Mercury now moving direct. Mercury not only leaves Taurus, where it's been since early April, but in fact, Mercury runs not through the last part of Taurus, and Mercury enters Gemini the same day that retrograde Pluto backs into Capricorn on June 11th, which is a really important day. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But Mercury enters Gemini on June 11th. This is its home sign. And so there's a feeling of our communication, our intellect, our thoughts are moving at a little bit or a lot more rapid pace. And so the events may seem to be happening quicker. There's more interactions. There's more things going on as Mercury is speeding up and running through Gemini. And in fact, Mercury moves through Gemini and out of Gemini before the end of the month. So in other words, Mercury enters Gemini on June 11th, and it enters Cancer on June 26th. And toward the end of the month, we get this incredible slowing down energy that really is working in the background all month. And so here's the thing, just coming around full circle now that I've laid out this kind of little bit of groundwork, is on a personal level, on an interactive level, on the level of things happening. It feels like we're moving in new territory. We're going ahead. But with Saturn slowing down, turning retrograde, Pluto retrograding back into Capricorn, Neptune barely moving at all because it stations at the very end of the month retrograde, we're not really getting anywhere. And it may feel like we're stuck to the past, reviewing stuff that we're just done with, but we can't be done with it. Did that make sense to you?
Yeah, I had a question about that actually. Since it's mostly like the outer planets are going retrograde, would you say that these like the larger stories of our lives are kind of taking that step back, and then the more personal stories, like the small like day-to-day things,
Yeah, that
feel
may
like
be
they're
one
moving
way of
forward?
looking at it. I think that the larger planets tend to be, there's a concept in homeopathy that says the more subtle the dosage, the more profound the results. And I think that the outer planets sometimes work that way. And in fact, when any planet is moving slower than it does normally, which all planets move their slowest when they're changing from direct to retrograde or retrograde to direct, that when a planet moves slower, it's maybe subtler, but it has more inertia. It has more power. It's not going as fast, but it really kind of sets up these really deep issues. And so I think you're right, Joe. I think that personally, we may feel like we're running all around, that we're doing this, we're doing that, we're getting this done. Whoop, that slipped through the cracks. Where we're going to an event, we're going to a party, we're having some sort of relationship stress, some home, family, work. Things are happening. The things are really moving. But when you look at the overall, take a step back and you look at it from a wider perspective, it's like, are we really making the progress that it feels like we're making? In other words, minute to minute, hour to hour, it might feel like we're getting a whole lot done, but day to day and week to week and month to month right now, not so much. And I think we'll see it somewhat in more global events. I think we'll, the inner planets the moon, sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and even Jupiter are acting as triggers to these slower moving planets that are kind of almost stationary all month. I mean, technically, they're not stationary, but for all practical purposes, Saturn, that's at 7 degrees 0 minutes Pisces on June 1st, and is at 7 degrees 5 minutes Pisces, and in there it moves forward a bit and then back. It moves, but still not a quarter of a degree in its entirety. We're just not making the progress that we'd like to make.
Right. And you did talk a little bit about Mercury going into Gemini as well. So do you think that like that Mercury like fast thoughts, fast like movement and all of that, do you think it's a good time to maybe like start planning, or is planning
Well,
not really the
it
thing?
adds to the illusion of accomplishing. It adds to the illusion of shaking things up and moving forward. I mean, we have another thing, even while Mercury is moving through Taurus. If we can step into the Wayback Machine, well, not the Wayback, but the not too far back machine, we remember that when Mercury turned retrograde, it was moving toward a conjunction with Uranus, and it never quite made it. It just like came within a degree or so of its conjunction to Uranus, and then it slowed down, apparently, Mercury did, and then it turned retrograde. And now, as Mercury is clearing its shadow, by June 4th, actually, this energy is tied up with the full moon that we'll get to in just a moment on June 3rd. But on June 4th, Mercury, while it's in steady, slow moving, plodding, determined Taurus, by June 4th, Mercury lines up with Uranus, and this is crazy. This is, it's almost like early warning for what it'll be like when it goes into Gemini. And yes, I think this is really a good time to up our ante in creating agendas and writing plans. We don't have to finalize them, but I think that the talking with our friends, with our employees or our employers, or even just our associates, this is a great time for sharing ideas because our mind is way more active than the physical reality around us that will still slow us down. And I think the negative thing here, or at least the potential trap, is that we can make ourselves a little crazy because we're sure that we're just doing all this brilliant thinking and everything's going on, but we're not getting where we're supposed to be getting. And therefore, we might think we're doing something wrong. Whereas we may not be doing something wrong, we may just be doing it on the wrong time scale.
Right. And what are some keywords that you use for Mercury Uranus usually? Like how can we think about this conjunction coming
Okay,
up?
two things. First of all, telephone, answer it. No. First of all, Uranus is considered to be the higher octave of Mercury. There's a thing that connects the inner and outer planets, Mercury to Uranus, Venus to Neptune, and Mars to Pluto. And I think that Mars to Pluto is the least convincing, although there is a case that can be made for it. But the Neptune being the higher octave of Venus, because Venus is I love you and Neptune is love. Neptune is the concept, but there's no personal in it. By the same token, Mercury is how I think. It's what I think. It's the words I use. It's the language I use. It's how you and I interact and we send information back and forth. Uranus is the system that holds those thoughts. In other words, Uranus is the nervous system. Uranus is electrical impulses. And let's never forget that all communication, all nervous activity in the brain, in the body, is ultimately electrochemical. Without electricity, there is no nerve impulse. It's actually a potassium sodium ion transfer that creates the moving of a nerve impulse down away from the center, from the axon to the dendrite. And so from that standpoint, when Uranus lines up with when Mercury, we always try to say the faster moving planet first. We don't always do that as well as we should, but it's a good habit to get to. It's a good habit to develop. When Mercury conjoins Uranus, it's like our nervous system is on fire. And the fire, though, is not the fire of fire signs, Aries, Leo, Sagittarius. It's the fire of an electrical spark. Lightning is high frequency fire. This is fire and air have something in common. And Uranus is lightning. Uranus is electrical. Neptune is magnetic. Together, Uranus and Neptune make electromagnetism. In fact, Hans Christian Ørsted coined the word electromagnetism at the conjunction of Uranus, electricity, and Neptune, magnetism, in 2021, right in there.
Oh.
Yeah, interesting little thing. He did it in a live demonstration and took this magnet and moved it back and forth over a closed circuit with a voltmeter, and the voltmeter moved, and he went electromagnetism, magnet, electric, electromagnet. Anyhow, so if we understand how electricity works, we understand how Uranus works, because Uranus works like lightning, which is, as Ben Franklin demonstrated, it's electrical, and it's an electrical spark, but it's like a very high frequency, instantaneous shot of fire. And what it does is it's sudden, it's surprising, and it's bright like fire is. And when the lightning of Uranus strikes, we sometimes call Uranus the awakener, because it's like, those pictures of the person who has the idea and the light bulb goes off. It's this on my shirt. This part is the Uranus. That is the, oh my God, epiphany, good idea, brilliant thought. That's just a nervous electrical circuit firing. And so when Mercury lines up with Uranus, our thinking can be really brilliant, but it can also be really wrong. It's just that it's loud and wild and electric and sudden. And, there's the saying that I like to use for Uranus is, when you're hot, and when you're not, you're, I don't know, in the south side of Cleveland somewhere. You're just, it's like on or off, because unlike other transits, Saturn, you see what's coming. You can't avoid it. Even with Neptune, it's like this mysterious field, but it grows and until it's there, and then it kind of eventually fades. Uranus's action is spontaneous. And if you've ever tried to photograph lightning, which I have, it's nearly impossible, because that in the middle of a storm, you can see the lightning around you and hear the thunder. And so that it's going to strike, but you don't know exactly when, and you don't know exactly where. And so you're sitting there with a camera and you're looking this way, and all of a sudden you hear, and you turn that way, and then there's the big one where you just were, and so when Mercury lines up with Uranus, it's often like erratic but brilliant thinking. It's genius. William Blake wrote in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he wrote, "The road of genius is a crooked one, whereas that of an improver is straight." Saturn is a straight road. Uranus is crooked. If you think of Uranus in its modern relationship to Aquarius, the jagged lines of Aquarius, it's almost like electricity in the air. And in fact, without moisture in the air can't conduct electricity. Just like our nervous system, without being wet, cannot make a nervous impulse or a thought. This is why Aquarius is not an air sign, is not a water sign. It's the water bearer, because when the air is wet, it has electrical impulses in it, and therefore it sparks thoughts.
And do
So,
you think it being in Taurus changes any of that? Because I'm thinking,
yeah,
like, with this image of the lightning and everything, I just
Yeah, it
imagine
does.
like that stick on the ground
It
that kind of
does, and
just
we'll feel
channels
that
it.
even more when Mars on June 26th moves to square Uranus. So we have Mercury conjoining Uranus on June 4th, and then we have Mars squaring Uranus on June 26th, I think. Yeah, June 26th. And so yeah, there I forgot your question.
Oh yeah, my question was, does it all
In
being in
Taurus.
Taurus
Yeah,
change
in
any of
Taurus.
that? Hmm.
So both Mars squaring Uranus in Taurus and Mercury conjoining Uranus in Taurus. Uranus don't like being in Taurus. Why?
Mm.
Because Uranus is about irrepressible sudden change. Taurus doesn't like change. Taurus is an object at rest, tends to stay at rest unless acted on by an outside force, Newton's laws of motion, and an object in motion tends to stay in motion. You got a Taurus laying on a couch, don't try to get him to mow the lawn. But if that Taurus is mowing the lawn, don't try to get him to come in for lunch because he's in motion and has got to stop only when he, she, or they are ready. So yes, Uranus and Taurus is very peculiar in as much as it doesn't change. It doesn't deal with adaptability and change as much as Uranus did when it was in Aries, or as much as it will when Uranus moves into Gemini in a few years. In Taurus, Uranus changes, but only under duress. In other words, think of the tide changing and how easily that water just really just rises and falls in great ways. And then compare that with granite, which even under great pressure doesn't change. And when finally it reaches a stress point, what happens? An earthquake.
Oh
And
wow.
that's how Uranus works in Taurus. There's fewer changes while Uranus is in Taurus, but the changes are more drastic because they're making up for all the changes that it avoided or didn't have. And so when Mercury goes across Uranus, it tickles it. The lightning strikes, and there are things that are said, things that we learn. There's interactions that occur. There's movement that is normally anathema to Mercury in Taurus. And also, even Uranus in Taurus doesn't like to change. And when Mars squares it later in the month, it's that same kind of thing. And I imagine in both of those days, around the 4th of June and around the 26th of June, give or take a few days, I think we'll see some real movement on some issues. And I would think that even now on the 1st, with the Mercury 3 degrees away from that conjunction to Uranus, that we're already seeing some Mercury-Uranus conjunction stuff in the United States with the movement on the resolution to this irresolvable, problem, with the whole, budget and debt ceiling and whatever. That is kind of like a Mercury conjunct Uranus, where the lightning strikes and somehow the impossible just happens. We think the thoughts that kind of break through the stalemate.
Yeah, and you said this leads us into this full moon in Sagittarius also. Like, and is that going to? Because whenever I think about Sagittarius, I tend to think about like that tarot card with the eight of wands with the speed and all that going forward and all that stuff. Do you think that going through this Uranus Mercury conjunction and then stepping right into the Sagittarius full moon, it can
It's actually the
continue?
other way around.
Oh,
It's
it's the
the
other way
full,
around.
yeah, the full moon. The full moon occurs on Saturday, on June 3rd, at 8:41, and that's and that's Pacific time. And so that occurs at 13 and a quarter degrees of Sagittarius to the sun at 13 degrees 18 minutes Gemini. Yes, because inherent in that full moon already, Mercury is a degree away from its conjunction to Uranus, which actually occurs within 24 hours, actually, yeah, even a little bit less than that, like within 18 hours or so, after the full moon. So that energy is already contained in that. And I think the other thing about this full moon is that we have the moon kind of in an interesting position. This is not obvious to those people who don't use harmonic aspects, and this is not a plug for anyone to go to astrologyhub.com/foundations, whatever that
Foundations
link.
3.
This is not a plug for that, but when we look at this full moon, it's past a trine to Pluto and Leo, the Sagittarius to Leo. So it feeding up into it, that's intriguing. And it's also past a square to Saturn because the full moon at 13, Saturn's at 5 Pisces. It almost looks like this full moon is not aspected at all. However, this full moon is a half a square away from Pluto. Now, remember, Pluto's at 0 degrees of Aquarius, and it's just less than a week away from backing into 29 degrees, 59 minutes of Capricorn. So this full moon, oh, and on top of that, we also have Venus that is at the full moon at 28.5 degrees of Cancer. And Venus is just getting ready to change signs because it moves into Leo on the 5th. That's just a couple of days a couple of days after the full moon. So we already are feeling the Venus opposed Pluto. And this is a deep emotional dive. This is a going into the underworld, whether we like it or not, dealing with things that may have been hidden or suppressed. They may be in reference to attachment, desire, money. I mean, all those Venusian things. But in some ways, this is a variation on the myth of Persephone being abducted by Hades, Pluto, into the underworld, because Venus is connecting up with Pluto. It's I think here of Thomas More, the guy who wrote Care of the Soul and Soulmates and the what is it, the reemergence, something of soul in everyday life. I can't think of the name of the title of that book. But before he wrote all those books, he wrote a book called Dark Eros before he got famous. And it was about how when we buy into love, Venus, it's not just the pretty, pleasant surface stuff. It's full spectrum. And there's a dark side that comes with it. And so I see Irene saying in the chat box room that she has Venus square Pluto natally. Anyone who has a Venus Pluto connection, whether it be by conjunction, opposition, trine, square, sextile, semisextile, sesquisquare, quintile, biquintile, subtile, bisubtile, I don't care what the aspect is. If you got Venus and Pluto connected in some way, you know what I'm talking about because you're more akin, you're more adjusted to go into those deeper, darker places, which can be just as exquisite and maybe even more exquisitely beautiful because of their intensity than the light and easy Venus in Taurus, trining, Jupiter in whatever, Virgo, whatever. And so we have Venus opposing Pluto. That's exact. Just as Venus moves into Leo on the 5th, because as Venus moves into Leo on the 5th, it immediately opposes Pluto. So that's already cooking. Now, let's come back to this full moon and the thing that everyone's going to miss unless they've taken my class or unless they hear me say it, I'm sure. And that is that the moon is at the point of Thor. We know that the point of Thales with an opposition is the point that is sextile one side of an opposition and trine the other. Well, the point of Thor is the point that is a half a square to one side of the opposition and a square and a half to the other side. In other words, the moon at 13 degrees of Sagittarius is half a square or semi-square or octile. It's 1/8, the half of a quarter is an eighth. The moon is semi-square to Pluto, and the moon is sesqui-square to Venus. Meanwhile, the sun is semi-square to Venus and sesqui-square to Pluto. And so we have this formation that kind of looks like a mystic rectangle. In a mystic rectangle, you have two crisscrossed oppositions, and the planets are separated by sextile trine, sextile trine. We have two crisscrossed oppositions at this full moon, except these points are separated by moon sesqui-square Venus, Venus semi-square Sun, Sun sesqui-square Pluto, and Pluto semi-square Moon. And it's not easy. This is not. This is a tough full moon, a lot more complicated and a lot more emotionally agitated than it might appear on the surface.
And do you have any like tips or tricks? Oh, I'm off camera. Oh, there I am. Do you have any tips or tricks for dealing with a full moon that's packed like that?
Yeah,
Or
Valium. No, I'm kidding.
I love that.
Xanax, your drug of choice. No, unfortunately, all drugs of choice basically keep us from experiencing the full spectrum lighting. This is a full spectrum full moon. I mean, all moons, in a way, are the maximum reflection on the inside to what's on the outside. Yeah, breathe, meditate, move. Breathe, meditate, move. We don't want to bottle the energy up. And again, this is all doubly so because Mercury is approaching its conjunction to Uranus. It's a degree away. And the worst thing that we can do while we have such a dynamic configuration of this rectangle of Thor, and that's a newly minted name that I minted specifically for this full moon. Many of us know what Thor's hammer is, and that's a configuration kind of like a yod, except a yod has a sextile at the base and then quincunxes. Well, if you widen that sextile to a square, you have a square at the base and then two sesqui-squares, 2 square and a halves. And that's called Thor's hammer, which is why I call this position of a planet that is a half a square one side of an opposition to a square and a half to the other side, the point of Thor. But since this is symmetrical all the way around, this is like Thor's rectangle. It's agitating, it's uncomfortable, and it's fed by this Mercury conjunct Uranus that has our nervous system going at the speed of light, whether we want to or not. Move, breathe, meditate. Don't meditate. Oh, I shouldn't say don't meditate sitting still. Everyone needs to do what they need, whatever they feel best. But meditating and trying to hold this energy still, it's going to get out one way or another. And so here it's, sure, do your still meditation, your vipassana, whatever, breathing, whatever, pranayama, whatever exercises you do, but then get out and walk or run or do something, dance. I would say that moving our hips, and that can be a metaphor for whatever you would like, but moving our hips is really important because when the energy locks up, that's when the lightning strikes. The lightning doesn't strike unless there's blocked energy. If energy was completely always flowing, there would never be any need for lightning because a spark is jumping a gap where there's resistance. And so there's a lot of resistance of energy in this because oppositions are the resistance created by tension, like a tug of war. And so we have Venus tugging on the rope away from Pluto, then we have the moon tugging on the rope away from the sun. And both of these are doing it in a way that is interfering with one another because semi-squares and sesqui-squares work like squares, but they're even more agitating. And so we can do something with it. It's great for creation. It's great for movement. It's great for action. But we got to be careful about just simply holding our breath. And again, holding our breath would be a metaphor for not expressing something, not moving on something that needs to be moving. And yeah. Aries
Yeah.
explains why tension doesn't have to suck, Alyssa says. And it's because the Aries energy will spontaneously interact with tension and relieve it or move it, whether appropriate or not. I can speak as a multi-planet Aries. And yeah, discerning light says move the hips. See, the hips are really the point in our physical body. If we're looking at somatic medicine, the hips basically keep the the sexual energy, the repressed energy, it keeps it down below the waist. And if you've ever seen anyone who's a real smart ass, a smart aleck, do you ever notice that they cock their hips? That hip stand, like it's the smart ass stand, or stand, it's the smart ass stance. When the hips are locked, the energy between the lower and upper half of the body doesn't move, it doesn't flow. And yet when we move our hips, whether we're doing a yoga practice or stretching or twisting or dancing, or even walking, the energy from flows from the lower part to the upper part of the body.
Right. And I'm wondering too if the fact that Venus is going retrograde in Leo and Pluto's already retrograde in Aquarius has anything like there.
Maybe, they don't catch up again because Venus doesn't retrograde back far enough to catch that opposition. But yeah, they're both. I mean, they're both heightened in their own way right now, for sure.
Yeah. So that's more of like a one and would you say that that's more of a one and done kind of story? It's not a thing that will have lots of back and
With the
forth.
exception of the Johnson and Johnson vaccine, I don't think in astrology there is such a thing as one and done. It's one and it resonates.
Hmm.
And it picks up on future resonances. There's never that. I mean, that's an analytical, technical astrology test tube version of life. Anything that's ever resonated will continue to resonate and be sensitive. It's how we move with it, but I don't think, I mean, look, I mean, Venus will move on, and once it turns direct by the fall, Venus will be moving on through Scorpio and it'll be squaring Pluto. And then Venus will come around and it'll conjoin Pluto and so on. And in the interim, there'll be other connections it will make. But yeah, I mean, I think they are both heightened now, and I think that is significant. But I do think that the days around this full moon are really important because I mean, look, we have Venus trining Neptune on the 2nd. We have the full moon on the 3rd. We have Mercury joining up with Uranus on the 4th, Venus moving into Leo and opposing Pluto on the 5th. Then the sun moves into that and it creates that exact sesquisquare with Pluto, which is really part of the full moon itself. And then there's a little bit of a breather, and then the energy begins to rock again around the 11th, because on the 11th, we have Mars making a square and a half with Neptune. We're confused again. What the hell is going on? We have Pluto backing into Capricorn. Okay, remedial learning, banks, government, constitution, roads, bridges, fundamental structures are not done being deconstructed by Pluto. And so we got basically the rest of calendar year 2023 with Pluto kind of finishing up the work that it started back at the real estate market crash and stock market crash back in 2008, which was perfectly timed with Pluto touching into Capricorn, backing up into Sagittarius, and then moving into Capricorn through 2008. And now as it's doing the same thing in Aquarius, with Capricorn to Aquarius, we can expect the other side of that. And I think that the financial market certainly is something to be looked at. But we look at the most fundamental thing, at least in the United States, and we look at how Pluto in Capricorn is basically deconstructing Roto-Rooter, taking out all the important things about our U.S. Constitution and forcing us to look at some of those things and to potentially reevaluate them. But on June 11th, not only does Pluto back into Capricorn, Mercury also moves into Gemini. And on top of that, as Mercury moves into Gemini, actually just, simultaneously, because you see, Pluto is now at 0 degrees 00 minutes of Aquarius, or 29 degrees and 59 and 3/4 minutes of Capricorn. And so at that same moment, I mean, that occurs at 2:35 a.m. And that occurs at 2:35 a.m. And just an hour later, Mercury trines Pluto and then moves into Gemini. Because so Mercury's entrance into Gemini is also a trine to Pluto, which is going to be very, very powerful. And that's also on the 11th. And on that same day, Venus makes a square with Jupiter, basically saying, okay, let's hold the magnifying glass over all this crazy shit and make it crazier. And let's make it so that if we got something that feels good, let's do it 3 times instead of just once. Oh, 3 times was great. Let's try it another 2 or 3 times. That Venus square Jupiter is about excessive, overindulgent behavior and other things, but it certainly can turn something into too much. And as part of this also, the sun is making a half square with Jupiter at the same time. So the 11th is an incredible rock and roll day that really doesn't let up because of half squares. The sun, the sun makes a half square to Venus, and then Mercury makes a half square with Chiron by the 13th. And this kind of culminates by the 15th with okay, you guys have gone too much, too far, too fast, slow the hell down. And who does that? Well, Mercury, as it's moving through early degrees of Gemini, reaches 7 degrees of Gemini and it squares Saturn. And Mercury square Saturn is basically, it's like the molasses freezes. It's like the running, there's a saying is, things are as slow as molasses in January, because molasses, when it's heated, pours like a liquid, but when it cools, it doesn't flow and it's kind of sticky. And Mercury now in Gemini, moving really fast, and our thoughts are all over the map and we're connecting. Mercury in Gemini likes to connect things. Mercury in Virgo is also active, but in Virgo, Mercury wants to find the things that are the most useful and use them. Mercury in Gemini doesn't give a shit about usefulness. It doesn't care about anything practical. It doesn't care if information is even true. Mercury in Gemini is an information slut. It has no judgment. It has no, it may have willpower. It has no won't power. If there are 2 things, it wants to connect them. So it's hungry for more data. And yet, as Mercury squares Saturn on the 15th, and we'll feel this for a day or 2 coming into it and for a little bit after it, it's all of a sudden we realize that we can't assimilate that much information that is coming from this whole run of Mercury moving into Gemini and trining Pluto and the Venus square Jupiter and all that stuff around the 11th. And so by the 15th, we're slowing down. And by the 17th, Saturn is retrograde. And from the 15th to the 17th, Saturn doesn't move. I mean, yeah, I know technically if we look at the books, Saturn turns retrograde at 10:27 a.m. on the morning of June 17th. Again, I'm using Pacific time. But here's the thing. Saturn on June 15th is at 7 degrees. This is at noon. It's at at 9 in the morning. It's at 7 degrees, 12 minutes of Gemini. And 2 days later, it's at 7 degrees, 13 minutes of Gemini. Of Pisces.
Pisces, yeah.
Sorry. In other words, in 2 days, Saturn moves less than 1/60th of a degree. And so we've hit like this resistance that we're not going to get through. And it's in the midst of that we have the new moon in Gemini. And so this is really crazy. And this is why I'm calling for the month, is it progress or is it retreat or review? Because it's like, it's not just the 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's a quarter step forward, a quarter step back, a quarter step forward, a quarter step back. We're moving into new territory with the high frequency, faster moving planets, but the slower ones keep anchoring us. And so we have Saturn stationary retrograde on the same day that we have this new moon at 26 and 3/4 degrees of Gemini, 26 degrees Gemini, 43 minutes. And that's actually, that new moon is squaring Neptune. It's a degree away, a little bit less than a degree away from squaring Neptune. So it's really tight. And the sun actually makes its square with Neptune the following day on the 18th. What does this mean? Now we have this information from all over the place, and yet we're careful about what we're using or what we're saying because Mercury is squaring Saturn. And meanwhile, this new moon in Gemini is squaring Neptune, which means that we better be careful about trusting those people who are telling us what's real. And we better clarify everything, and we better make sure that our sources are good. And we also better be careful that we don't inadvertently mislead or even outright lie to someone else because the sun and moon are both squaring Neptune. Now, granted, this also allows for a creative imagination and higher thought and that spiritual stuff, but it's a square, and so there's dynamic conflict between wanting to put words to those things that we can't put words to. So, and then the other thing that's happening right at that same time is we're getting a sextile from Jupiter to Saturn. This may be the most important but most subtle aspect of the month, because remember, we had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction back around Christmas time of 2000. That was the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. Well, this is the first zodiacal or Ptolemaic aspect since then, as Saturn is retrograding back into the sextile with Jupiter. And this is exact on the 19th at 7 degrees Taurus, 12 minutes. That's Jupiter, with Saturn at 7 degrees, 12 minutes of Pisces. And so this is another piece of stable data. This is a throwback to the past because Saturn is retrograde, or at least stationary. I mean, again, this is occurring at 7 degrees, 12 minutes. That's the exact same place that Saturn was a week ago on the 13th. When it was, even before it was squared by Mercury. And so we got this balance between expansion, Jupiter, contraction, Saturn, between big ideas and wanting to take them forward, coming off of that Venus square to Jupiter. And now we have Saturn or Jupiter sextiling Saturn. And again, we're finding that middle ground, and we can make the most of it. We have the most opportunity to move forward if we restrain ourselves and find a way to pull in those opportunities and to ground them. And so this is an incredible period of time. But interestingly, we're still talking, except for the Jupiter-Saturn sextile, we're still talking all month aspects from the moon, sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars to outer planets. There are no other really, outer planet to outer planet aspects. So that is very important. And then, of course, we, inch forward, and by the 21st, we have the summer solstice here in the northern hemisphere, winter solstice down south of the equator. And that occurs at 7:57 a.m. on June 21st Pacific time. And that is the beginning of an entirely new season. And it actually starts off rather smoothly because we're moving toward a Mars trine Chiron that is exact on June 22nd. Mars trine Chiron. And we'll say more about that. Oh, no, we'll say a little bit about it right now. Mars and Chiron sometimes are buggers, especially when they don't get along, when they're aspected harshly. But this is a great opportunity to learn those things that we've mislearned, because Chiron isn't only the wounded healer. Chiron is also the original mentor. Chiron was the teacher of Asclepius and Hercules, and one of the reasons why the gods granted Chiron immortality, and that was not only because he was an extraordinary healer, but he was an extraordinary teacher. So with Mars trining Chiron, that's exact on the 22nd, we have the ability to move through old wounds, either by forgiving others and releasing ourselves from being tied to the past, or by simply processing old wounds and hurts and pains and revisioning them. But it gets better, because on the solstice day, on the 21st, Mercury reaches that midpoint between the trine from Saturn to Chiron. Saturn and Chiron are both at 19 degrees. And on the 21st, let me just see here. Yeah, on June 21st, Mercury reaches first the sextile to Mars at 18 degrees 40 minutes, and then the sextile to Chiron. So Mercury is kind of coming right through the middle of those two planets. And again, the emphasis is on communication. Here, Mercury is no longer tied up by the resistance to Saturn. It now, if it's learned its lesson, it has a way to move forward, and it's through communication that this healing occurs. So the 21st, and I think is a really, into the 22nd, is a really, really important period of time.
Yeah. It seems like the big bulk of the events of the month are all happening towards the beginning, and then things seem to kind of like cool down or like resolve themselves. Would you say that that's true?
Well, I would, accept after we have the Mercury, the Mercury Mars Chiron little minor grand trine, whatever you want to call that. By the 25th, Mercury then squares Neptune, and this can be a bit of a pain in the neck, because again, we're not able to discern reality from fantasy. We can't tell whether it's a fairy tale or a how-to manual. And that's okay, as long as we realize it, because we can always clean up later. But we have to be careful about thinking that our fantasies and illusions are real. Now, that's on the 25th in the afternoon. By the 26th, which means we're going to be feeling this for days before, is the Mars Square Uranus. And if you call that quieting down, I think that you and I do different astrology, because Mars Square Uranus is actually one of the most potentially explosive, and lest anyone run off thinking that we're going to get bombed or bomb someone. And of course, we do almost every day, and we certainly could. But it can be metaphysically explosive. It can be, earth-shattering, something that happens that leads us into kind of revisioning what is real. And then that's on the 26th, the same day that Mercury leaves Gemini and then takes a deep breath and settles into Cancer, which on one hand looks good because it quiets down, but on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily express everything that it's thinking. It somaticizes, it turns things into emotions, and the slowing down does continue toward the end of the month, because by the 28th, the sun, now moving through Cancer, actually reaches 7 degrees of Cancer, where it trines Saturn at 7 degrees of Pisces. And so we're getting another level of stabilization. And then Mercury moving toward its superior conjunction with the sun. That's exact on the last day of the month, on June 30th. But what that means is both the sun and Mercury both trine Saturn on the 28th and 29th, while Venus is now forming an exact trine with Chiron. Neptune is stationary, and it turns technically stationary retrograde on the 30th at 27 degrees Pisces, 41 minutes. But it's at 27 degrees 41 minutes on the 25th, a full week ago, and it's at 27 degrees 39 minutes back mid-month. So Neptune isn't moving very much, but its retrograde turn on the 30th, along with the sun's alignment with Mercury, certainly shows the heightened importance of Mercury all month, But now we're not saying everything that we think or know. Things are being internalized, but there is more room for stability by the end of the month. I do agree with you there.
Right. So would the Mercury Neptune square followed by the Mars Uranus square be the Mercury Neptune almost be like a fake out? Like we think that things are kind of slowing down, but then comes Mars Uranus and things go
Yeah,
wild
I don't
again.
know that Mercury Neptune will make it feel like things are slowing down. I think most of us will just be a bit confused. We're going to be confused.
That's the
Um,
perfect word.
but remember, and I know I've said this before, the word confused is an important word because it comes from two Greek words. Con, like conjunction, means with. It's like coming together. And fusion is when two things actually do melt together. They lose their boundary. Confusion is what happens when we fall in love. Why? Because the boundary between me and you dissipates.
Hmm.
Neptune's primary job is to dissolve Saturn's hard edges. The ego thinks there's a hard edge between me and everything else out there. That's the job of the ego. When Mercury squares Saturn, I'm sorry, when Mercury squares Neptune, basically what that does is that dissolves the hard edges of the mercurial thoughts that we believed were fact. We become confused. Confusion is only difficult if we think we need to have a hard edge and a sharp boundary between me and you. Confusion, it's one of the best techniques for hypnotizing someone. It's sometimes referred to as the confusion technique. It's basically the fast stage hypnotist will go to a subject and go, give me your hand, it's hot, it's cold, look up, look down, look this way, your eyes are getting heavy, now you're wide awake, now you're asleep. And the person's so confused that they grab onto whatever it is that's stable, sometimes referred to as a stable datum. And so with Mercury square Neptune, it's a primary setup for us to find a piece of stable data, and everything else becomes important. I'll tell you some of the pieces of stable data that people find that may be okay for them in the moment, but if a friend of yours finds one of these pieces of stable data, you lose them often as a friend because they don't have anything to talk about anymore. What do I mean? What's a stable datum? Someone discovering Scientology, someone learning Shoshuran Buddhism and knowing that chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo will make everything else okay. Someone taking Jesus as their savior. Now, I'm not saying any one of these things is a bad thing to do. I'm not saying it's good, but I'm not saying it's bad in perspective. It's just that when we're confused, we often grab onto something. And that something then becomes inflated in its importance, and we become imprinted with it, and then we're stuck with it, whether it makes sense in the future or not. So that's the danger of the Mercury square Neptune. If we can remain flexible, fluid, and adaptable, then we get to go to these amazing places. We get to learn from these things and then still come back to the Mars square Uranus the following day and do something outrageous with it and hopefully not get caught, or hopefully do it in a way that is socially acceptable enough that we, don't blow things up. The problem when lightning strikes, it relieves the tension. But if there's so much tension, like Yellowstone Park back 25 years ago, the park was so dry and so dead and so overgrown that when lightning struck, it burned down most of Yellowstone. And everyone thought Yellowstone was a disaster. It would never come back. And 20 years later, naturalists are saying it's never been so healthy. This is the way Uranus works. The greater the stress or tension, the more the lightning striking has to burn things to the ground, which may feel awful in the moment. And if you're, a worm living there, well, it probably killed you. But
Hmm.
it basically reinvigorates and re-energizes, re-stimulates, which is also why Uranus is called the Great Awakener, because it awakens and re-stimulates life in general.
Right. So I guess the cautionary sort of thing is to not hold on too tight to something during the Mercury Neptune uh, square. So when the Mars Uranus square comes around, we're not in that inflexible sort of like.
Yes, and yes, but, or yes, and. The trick often with what some people call the what is it, the iron fist and the velvet glove. When do you hold on to something, and when do you kind of move with it? The problem is that if we hold on to something too tight, it kills the life energy. If we think of Saturn and Uranus, if something becomes overly Saturnine, it's dead. It can't. It no longer moves. It can't be Jupiter and expand, and it can't be Uranus. There's no electrical current. It's not. It's no longer alive, and so we have to find a place that's never the same. This is different for every person. That's somewhere in between that velvet glove and the iron fist. There are decisions we need to make and hold on to certain things, but if we hold on to them too tight, then that can become problematic.
Right on. Nice. And is that it for the month, or there's more after the
Well,
Mars
there's more
Uranus?
after this, but then we're into July, and by contract, I'm not allowed to speak about July, or when I'm kidding.
July is
No,
an exciting month, though.
that actually takes us right up to the closing, trine of the Mercury and Sun to Saturn, which I think is very stabilizing. The Neptune stationary retrograde, even though it's been stationary for pretty much the whole month, or at least the second part of the month. I mean, Neptune at the beginning of the month is 27 degrees of Pisces in 29 minutes, and at the end of the month, it's still at 27 degrees and 41 minutes. That's like about a sixth of a degree in the entire month. And then, of course, we close the month, the last aspect of the month, at 10 p.m. on June 30th, is the superior conjunction of Mercury and the Sun. And Mercury, when it's retrograde, is inside. If you drew a straight line when Mercury is retrograde and conjunct the Sun, if you draw a straight line toward the Sun, you go through the orbit of Mercury. But when Mercury is direct, as it is now, it's on the far side of the Sun, which means you draw that straight line, you get to the Sun first and then Mercury, which means that there's a chance or a way for Mercury to get out beyond the brilliance, the brightness of the will, of the consciousness of the self. And of course, this is all occurring while the Sun and Mercury are trining Saturn. I think this is a very sound and solid way to end the month. And so let's just take it from there and end it there while we have our feet temporarily
Right.
on the ground, in a way that maybe has us looking back and seeing where we've been, and looking forward and seeing where we're going, in a way that's not built completely on imaginary friends, people. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with imaginary friends either,
Right.
but this is like an antidote to that, because we certainly have our share of that.
Yeah, and I think that that's really interesting because I like the metaphor that you used of like the iron fist and velvet glove, because it feels like throughout the whole entire month, that's the flow. We're iron fisting, then silk glove, what is it, velvet glove, and we're in this dance between the two up until we get to the end of the month, where we have the Saturn, Mercury, Sun
Yeah.
trine situation, where we actually get to like process, would you say, like process and learn from all of that
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
instability, that
Yeah.
back and forth
Yeah, it
sort of.
would. And while we're talking about the iron fist and the velvet glove, that reminds me of a Ron Davison line. Ron Davison was the president of the London Astrological Lodge back in the, I think probably in the early '60s, and before Charles Harvey. But he wrote a book called Astrology. He's also, which is a brilliant book. And he's also the guy who came up with the idea of a relationship chart called the Davison method of chart comparison. Well, Ron Davison used to say that that astronomy is like a glove, and astrology is like the living hand inside the glove. Just another hand metaphor, not a Rob hand
Nice.
metaphor.
And it's funny because we're heading into Gemini season and we've been talking
Finger,
about hands,
fingers,
fingers the
fingers
whole
and
time.
toes.
It's awesome. And that's actually really nice because it feels like the universe itself is kind of like, hey guys, you're gonna be doing a lot of back and forth, a lot of handling two opposing forces at once. Here's Gemini season for you, so you can
Yes.
process it through.
Yes. Well, and I'm not pleased that Amanda had a little thing that emergency that she had to deal with today. She's fine, but I am pleased that we had a chance to talk. This has been great hanging out with you for
Oh,
for the hour,
thank you
Joe.
so much.
Thank you
Yeah,
very
of
much.
course. All right, guys. So I think that is it for today. Before we go, just a couple of reminders. If you love learning from Rick, Rick has many courses. We talked about one of them so far. We talked about Foundations 3, which is all about harmonic aspects. But Rick also has Foundations 1 and 2, and the chart reading extravaganzas, which I think were also in 1 and 2.
And I think that there's a relationship workshop and a quincunx workshop. Yeah, there's a pile of stuff that you guys got of mine. People can find them.
Would you say that the relationship workshop would be a good one to kind of dip your toes in with this Venus Pluto opposition going on?
I think that relationships are always good to dip one's toes into,
Yeah.
But then again, I do have a very close Venus Neptune opposition from the 5th to the 11th. So you would expect me to say that from Aries to Libra relationship.
Oh, no way. That's awesome. Cool. So if you guys want to find all of Rick's courses, it's all on astrologyhub.com/academy. You see all of Rick's courses and all of the other courses that we have as well.
And Rhiannon said, take Foundations 3 if you want your mind blown. Thank you very much, Rhiannon. I hope there's no, brain damage from blowing out one's mind. And thank you, Susan and Tanya and Irene and Shakti and Stephen and so many people in the chat room. You guys make this like fun, and you are appreciated.
Yeah, Stephen is a regular. I love seeing Stephen in the comments all the time.
By the way, I just should mention before we bail that for those of you who may have missed it, I'm going to be at the Omega Institute, which is just north of New York City. It's like the most iconic New Age cosmic place on the planet. It's a place where people like Thich Nhat Hanh, Ram Dass, Deepak Chopra, Marianne Williamson, Wayne Dyer. I mean, all these people, have blessed this place with their presence. And on the weekend of June 30th, that's just, the end of this month, I will be there for a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 3-day intensive workshop on astrology at the consciousness at the crossroads. And I will be sharing this weekend with 4 amazing astrologers, all or most of whom are astrology hubbers, including the infamous Anne Ortely,
Oh, no way.
Rachel Lang, Maurice Fernandez, and Lynn Bell, who's coming over from Paris. And the 5 of us will be doing this. You can find out more by either going to my Instagram, which is Rick Levine Astrologer, and there's a link in the bio there, or by going to iomega.org. It's a little bit hard to find. They have so many things at their site, but it's going to be a great weekend. It's going to be a relatively small group. And there's still a little bit of room available. So if that sounds intriguing to you, it's going to be a fantastic weekend. I've taught at Omega before. It's an absolutely magical place in the country, in the Hudson River Valley. It's definitely rural, and it's going to just be gorgeous there midsummer. So
I wish I could go because this is the one that it's actually close to where I live, but I'll be in California throughout all of July and
Well,
the end of June.
Rachel Lang and I will be back at Omega in October.
Oh, no way.
Yeah,
Nice.
doing another weekend,
Sweet.
but that's too far in the future. I'm not allowed to talk about it.
October is an exciting month then. We'll see you then.
All right,
All
guys.
right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a blast. Have a bouncy June. It sounds like it's very much necessary. So I will see you guys on the next one. All right. Bye-bye.